Good morning, Western Cape Education Department. We have gone live on this. My name is Joel. I'm sitting in the background with Haroon Mohammed, Ishmael, Karen Wallstra, and Katie. They've got an amazing presentation to give for you guys today. I see we've got 6 followers already on it. They're going to be starting sharp in 2 minutes' time. If you've got a spare moment, share this with your friends, family, send it on WhatsApp. And there's going to be some interesting guests coming through. Lots of preparation has gone through to this, and it's quite an important topic that they'll be discussing. I'm going to be in the background saying goodbye now. Have fun, and don't forget to like, share, and share the love with everyone. Cheers.
Thank you.
Thanks, Joel.
Good morning, everyone.
Hi, good morning, Ricky.
Good morning. Good morning. My clock is saying 10:59 still, so
Okay.
we'll hold. Good morning, everybody. Goeiemorgen, Molweni. Welcome to this important webinar. Thank you very much for joining the webinar on gender-based violence. As you all know, COVID-19 has brought with it a deepening of the immense challenges in our society. And one of these challenges is the increase in gender-based violence. And interestingly, it's a flip side of the positive that COVID-19 has brought to us, which is that it has brought us closer to our families. But given the situation that we have, unfortunately, we're seeing increasing incidences of gender-based violence. So today's program is titled Addressing Gender-Based Violence Through Life Orientation. And we have a solid line of speakers to assist us in addressing the complex and, as you know, centuries-long situation with regard to it. First up, it's my pleasure to invite Ms. Karen Dudley, who is the Director for General Education and Training in the Western Cape Education Department. She's a very high energy, high skill, dynamic lady. And without further ado, let me invite her to say the words of welcome. Over to you, Ms. Dudley. Ms. Dudley, are you with us? We seem to be having a challenge with Ms. Dudley's connection. I'm just thinking, Mr. Taladia, should we proceed and then bring her in later?
Okay, we can proceed, Mr. Mohammed, and then bring Ms. Dudley in after my presentation, I think.
Okay, all right. So next in line on our program, as was advertised, is Mr. Ismail Taladia. He is the Senior Curriculum Planner, also in the Western Cape Education Department, in the same GET Directorate led by Ms. Dudley. His specialization is life orientation. He is equally highly energetic and highly skilled as Ms. Dudley. And they also share in common national representation in volleyball. Without further delay, Mr. Taladia, over to you.
Thank you, Mr. Mohammed, and good morning to the colleagues and all our guests. I see we have guests from India. I see we have guests from the United Kingdom, Hull University, amongst a whole host of other academics, and most of all, importantly, those teachers that we are going to be addressing this morning. Colleagues, the issue of gender-based violence has come up quite often, especially over the last couple of months. But there was also a period last year in 2019 when the issue of gender-based violence was high up on the agenda. And inevitably, the politicians would make the request to the education department. So what is being done about these issues? We talk about comprehensive sexuality education, we talk about gender-based violence, amongst a whole host of other very important issues that affects our community. And inevitably, those messages or would be sent through to my desk, and we'll ask, so what is life orientation doing about it? It's not being sent to mathematics. It's not being sent to EMS. Our economic subject is being sent to life orientation. And in speaking to the issue of life orientation, when you go back into the curriculum, you will understand the importance of life orientation and how we need to address some of these topics. And so, in as much as the curriculum speaks to all of the content that we're going to be talking through today, the pivotal individual in this whole process are our teachers. And so this morning I'm going to be speaking both to the life orientation curriculum as part of addressing the issue of gender-based violence, but also focusing on our teachers who are pivotal in getting the correct messages to our learners. And I think this is critically important in terms of what we do. So I've put up there a little quote, we cannot force someone to hear a message they are not ready to receive, but we must never underestimate the power of planting that seed. And if I go through the life orientation curriculum from grade 4 right up into grade 12, if we planting that seed at grade 4 level or even at grade 1 level, surely we must pull that thread throughout until that learner leaves the basic education system. And I'm going to demonstrate to you during the course of this presentation how important that is to our learners, because we start with that messaging in grade 4, and I'm going to show you exactly how that message is then drawn through the curriculum. So why do the politicians and the community come to life orientation? Because life orientation is a uniquely designed subject. It has different specialities. We talk about the implementation of physical education. Physical education, by its very nature, is almost a standalone subject, yet teachers are required to implement physical education. We speak to the issue of careers and career choices, which is a thread that runs throughout our curriculum. We talk about comprehensive sexuality education, which is critically important, especially seeing the kind of impact that teenage pregnancy, amongst other things, have on our communities. We talk about developing emotional intelligence within our learners. So the life orientation curriculum is critically important in that process of getting the correct messages to our learners. And what it basically says that we need to be teaching all of these very unique skills to our learners. And in teaching those unique skills, we need to be talking to the issue of addressing the 21st century skills as we prepare learners for the fourth industrial revolution. So we spoke about the 4 C's in 21st century skills. But over the past year, we've seen the development of 2 additional C's to that. So we're talking about the 6 C's of the 21st century skills as we prepare learners for the fourth industrial revolution. And we've chatted quite a bit around communication. We've spoken around critical thinking. We talk about that creativity. And more importantly, we're talking about collaboration. But what is fundamental to addressing basic gender-based violence is the issue of character building. And I think this particular skill that we need to develop within our learners is very important for our teachers to manage in terms of developing character within our learners. And then, of course, the 6th E that we are making reference to speaks to citizenship, because if we have good character and we follow collaboration and we have good communication, then we're presenting our learners with a mindset that will contribute to being a good citizen. And so we're taking all of that as a collective and we're wanting to present that to our learners in order for our learners to understand the importance of that personal and self-development. So if we look at the curriculum, and I want to start at grade 4 and say the curriculum speaks to gender-based violence. In grade 4, we're talking about emotions, we're talking about dealing with conflict, we're talking about appropriate responses to bullying, because bullying in itself is the basis of where gender-based violence is going to emanate from. So it does become important that we focus on all of these aspects, and it's already being dealt with at grade 4 level. If we move to grade 5, we're talking about relationships between peers, older people, and strangers. And again, often gender-based violence is directed from an older individual to a teenager or to a younger child. And so in grade 5, we're talking to these things. We're talking about child abuse, both physical and emotional. We're talking to our grade 5s about dealing with violent situations. If we move to grade 6, we're talking about problem solving in conflict situations. We're talking again the issue of bullying. We're talking about gender stereotyping, sexism, and abuse. And these are all embedded within the CAPS curriculum for the intermediate phase. If we move to the senior phase, here we're talking specifically on gender-based violence. In grade 8, we look, as I've highlighted there for you, defining gender-based violence at grade 8 level. At grade 7 level, we're already talking about appropriate behavior in a relationship. We're talking about personal feelings that impact on sexuality. And we know that the LGBTI community is within our society and they are here to stay. And therefore, we need to address that as we do with all of our other topics that we deal with within the life orientation curriculum. We talk in grade 9 around common acts of violence at home. We talk about reasons that violence occur in families, the impact on violence on the individual. So again, our life orientation curriculum has the topics that speaks to the issue of gender-based violence. If we go to the FET, so in the FET, grade 10, grade 11, and 12, in grade 10, we're talking about power and power relationships and gender roles. In grade 11, gender roles and the effects on health and well-being. And in grade 12, we're talking to conflict resolution. Now, if we take all of these topics as a collective, then we see from grade 4 right into grade 12, we're addressing the issue of gender-based violence. So when politicians come to us and also what is schools and what is the education department doing about addressing the issue of gender-based violence or comprehensive sexuality education, then I can show them there's the CAPS curriculum. So we've got it in the curriculum. The more important part of this, ladies and gentlemen, are the pivotal individuals in this process, and that is our teachers. So I'd like to talk to our teachers at this point in time in terms of addressing the issue of gender-based violence. And I'm wanting to say to our life orientation teachers, you have to be the role model. If we're going to beat the issue of gender-based violence, then we've got our teachers to be the role models in this process. But what does it also say to our teachers and to our school managers and the education department as a whole? We're basically saying to you that you cannot have any Tom, Dick, and Harry being put into the life orientation classroom. You require specialists. You require people with passion that are going to be speaking to all of these very important and sensitive topics. So one of the first things that I want to make reference to in terms of the role of the teacher as that role model, it speaks to the issue of language. how a teacher comes into the classroom, how the teacher speaks to his learners or to her learners. What kind of language are they using? What kind of terminology are they using? Is it derogatory? Do they make a mention when they're talking to a learner, a male learner that is effeminate? Do they use derogatory language when addressing such a learner? Do they show instances of wanting to favor the uh, girl learner over the boy learner? Does the teacher do that? Does the teacher have favorites? Does the teacher use foul language in the classroom? So language is very important in terms of looking at changing the mindset of our learners. Because if our teachers are not addressing the learners in the correct manner, not using good, solid language in order to address particular issues, then the learners are going to take their message from that teacher. And it becomes important how the teachers need to realize the impact that they have on learners. And that impact is not only through the language that they use, but also through their actions. And so one of the issues that I want to talk to also is the issues of values in education. What are the actions of the teachers? Do they speak to the issue of respect to their learners? Do they speak with respect? If they speak about another teacher, and this often happens, a teacher will speak about another teacher in the classroom. Do they speak about that teacher with respect? Do they address their learners with respect? When the learners have done something that the teacher is not happy with, how does the teacher respond to that learners? If they are learners that have issues in terms of being effeminate, is and does the teacher show tolerance? So as teachers, you have and we have a great responsibility in enforcing, and I don't want to use the term enforcing because it is part of the gender-based violence. We rather want to say that our teachers must be modeling that sense of responsibility, those good values in the classroom, the respect for time, amongst other things. So, how do we get the teachers then to change the mindset of our learners? And when we're talking about these issues, it is important that the teacher has the content knowledge. Do the teacher understand what he or she needs to speak about when they go into a classroom? And again, I go back to the issue of teachers not being, any teacher not being put into the life orientation classroom. The attitude of the teachers become very important. And I can refer back to teachers that I had in high school that had their own particular views and their own attitudes that were not ones that would support the issue of being tolerant. So we learn from that as learners, as young people. We learn from the actions of those teachers. And I want to take one of my pet hates is the issue of men urinating in public, because that speaks to disrespecting not only others in the community but also to females. And because we're allowing it to become a norm in our society, it is part of laying the foundation, in my mind, to gender based violence, because we're showing disrespect. For a man, any male, to stand in public, whether it's against his vehicle, whether it's against a wall, whether it's against a tree, if they're doing it in public, they're showing disrespect. And it doesn't speak to the values of that particular individual. And if he's disrespecting everybody around him, then that is the same disrespect he will take into his home or into his workplace. And it's important that we understand that, ladies and gentlemen, that we need to have this mindset shift. And then I want to talk to the emotional intelligence of our teachers. Teachers, you have a great responsibility. We cannot address the issue of gender based violence if within ourselves we are not able to control our environment and control our attitude and direct our learners to issues that may impact on what we do. So in closing, I want to go back to that quote that I mentioned to you earlier, which speaks to the issue of planting that seed. If we're planting that seed at grade 4 level, the curriculum speaks to taking that thread from grade 4 into grade 12. And if we're doing that and we act on it through demonstrating the role model that we expect from our teachers in terms of addressing gender-based violence, in speaking to the issue of comprehensive sexuality education, then we are going to make an impact on our learners. And I see life orientation being part of that particular process. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to address you on this issue. I think it is critically important, and we need to make an impact on our learners from the moment they step into our schools until they leave at grade 12 level. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ismail. We can clap hands for him, even though it's a virtual clap. Thank you very much for that excellent input, particularly in showing the spaces and opportunities in the life orientation curriculum where gender-based violence issues can be addressed, and also for putting it into the broader context. Our next presentation is from Sibokasi Jonas. She's the founder of Wrestling Dawn Arts. She is a poet, performer, storyteller. She's qualified in English literature from the University of Cape Town. She's also got a qualification in drama, and she's got a distinguished record of awards in the performance arena, particularly in poetry, drama, and also on television. So I'm going to hand over to the team to bring up that presentation. The sound, we're having a sound problem, technical team.
Technical team reporting in. The YouTube video will be posted on the live link after this video so that you can go back and watch her 15-minute video. It's on the brand new Western Cape Education Department Life Orientation YouTube page, and we will share that with you guys then. Enjoy the rest of the presentation.
Are we presenting, or should we move on with the program? Okay. Definitely. All right. So our next presenter is Katie Modrao. She's the South African country manager for A21, and most of their work is in the human trafficking arena. And without further ado, I'm going to hand over to you, Katie.
Perfect. Thank you, sir. Thank you for the opportunity to be part of this webinar today. I must say it is an absolute honor to work alongside the Western Cape Education Department. A21 has had quite a long relationship, actually, that has culminated in a wonderful MOU where our organization has brought curriculum specifically around human trafficking to life orientation within high school. That presentation or that curriculum is called Bodies Are Not Commodities, which I'll unpack a little bit later. But I thought what I would do is I would tell you a little bit about the organization and who we are. We are a global anti-human trafficking organization. Our office in South Africa has been around since 2013, but we're one of 17 operational offices globally, and we're a 12-year-old organization. So our aim is to abolish slavery everywhere forever. It's a massive task to do, but we honestly believe that this is not just the work of one person or one organization or a bunch of organizations. We actually believe that abolition of slavery is something that everybody can take part in, which is why we so strongly believe in education. Mr. Taladia, you were talking about character and building character, and one of the C's was citizenship, talking about citizenship. And we hold those values as an organization, how to bring out modern day abolitionists and how to bring out people who are actually concerned with their neighbor and concerned citizens. So let me unpack a little bit about what human trafficking is, because that'll show you why we believe it's so important to unpack in schools. Human trafficking is ultimately the illegal trade of human beings for the purpose of exploitation. The illegal trade of human beings for the purpose of exploitation. So Joel, if you want to bring up the next slide, we all have everyday commodities in our home. We have bread, we have milk. Maybe you're using soy milk or almond milk or gluten-free bread at the moment, but we all have these everyday commodities in our homes. And what human trafficking is doing is it's reducing a human life to a commodity. Not yet, to a commodity, something that would actually be used. And when you've used it up, you just go down to the store and buy another one. That is what human trafficking is doing to lives, is just taking a human life and putting a value on it, something that can be used until it's no longer needed. The global reality of human trafficking, you'll see in the stats that are coming up now, it's not a small crime. You can take the next slide. There are at least 40.3 million people in slavery around the world. So if you think of the population of South Africa, that's just shy of our population. And the reality is within South Africa, we have at least 155 slaves, at least 155,000 slaves within our country. But with that global reality of 40.3 million, every 30 seconds, another person is becoming a victim of trafficking across an international border. But the reality is of this, that 99% of those victims will never be rescued. So of people who are recruited into human trafficking, 99% will never be identified. And in South Africa, the unfortunate reality, the horrific reality, is that 54% of our population shows high indicators for human trafficking vulnerability. We have a large portion of our population that show high vulnerability indicators to being trafficked, which is why we feel this is so vital to be unpacked within the school system. So where does this link to gender-based violence? We're talking about human trafficking, or are we talking about GBV? But the reality is that human trafficking is actually a form of gender-based violence. Yes, human trafficking happens to men, to women, to boys, to girls, no matter your sexual orientation or gender, no matter where you are in society, where you live, human trafficking can happen to anybody. But the reality is that for modern day slaves, 71% are accounted for in children and in women. So that shows that it is a very gender biased crime, if you want to call it that way. And within sex trafficking and sexual exploitation, 99% of the victims are women and children. So if we see that, we can see that it is very heavily perpetrated against the girl child and against women. But also, if you look at the definition of gender-based violence, we're talking about the use of violence, the use of coercion, the use of deprivation of liberty. That's in the official definition of GBV. Well, in the definition of human trafficking, we look at coercion, abuse, force. That is all used to grab someone's consent in order to use them in trafficking. Now, the types of exploitation that we see in human trafficking, there's many of them, but within gender-based violence, I would say we're probably looking at domestic servitude and at sexual exploitation. Sorry, it seems like my PowerPoint has been cut off a bit there. But domestic servitude and sexual exploitation. Now, domestic servitude is when a person is exploited in a private residence. So they're a household slave, whether they're doing household work, cooking, cleaning, nannying work, garden work, but they're exploited in someone's private home. So being able to identify them is very difficult because they're in a private home. And secondly, then sexual exploitation, which I think is the most common one that we all know, is being used for sexual services on whatever form they may take. And then lastly, online sexual exploitation, when someone is groomed on an online platform like Facebook, like Zoom, like the games that our children play online, like TikTok, like Instagram, which is why it's so vital that our children are aware and our learners are made aware of the issue of human trafficking and how they can be recruited. Now, the question that we get asked all the time is, how does someone become a victim of trafficking? How does someone become a victim? And the reality is this one word, vulnerability. So I spoke to you about 54% of our population being vulnerable. If 54% of our population has these high vulnerability indicators, that is what the traffickers are going to be preying on. So what type of vulnerability indicators are we talking about? Well, poverty, massive indicator within our context. substance abuse, or the normalization of substance abuse within the home. I saw some of the comments, people were talking about this needs to start at home. Yes, it does. But very often these activities or these actions are normalized within the home. And so the child does not necessarily know that it's not normal or it's not healthy within an environment. Maybe exposure or normalization of violence within the home setting. These are all things that render someone completely vulnerable to being preyed on in human trafficking. So what are the types of recruitment methods that we see? Now remember, a trafficker will prey on that vulnerability and they will use it to recruit someone. So we see false job opportunities. Can you imagine if your family's in desperation or you want to get out of an abusive situation? You're going to take a job opportunity that's going to give you hope, that's going to give you an income. It's an answer to that vulnerability or desperation. Maybe the promise of a better life. I'm going to take that promise because it's going to get me out of abuse at home or the vulnerable situation. And lastly, false relationships or lover boy scheme. Now, this I feel is so vital that is unpacked within our learners, especially in high school, is lover boy methods or the grooming using relationship. You can go to the next slide. Very often, relationships are used to, half the slide is missing there, but that's okay. Relationships are used to actually groom young girls and young boys, but mostly young girls, to trust this older person, and who would then use that trust relationship in order to exploit the person later, or to get them to perform illegal work. Now, how this often takes the form of is an older man who will then love on the younger girl, develop this trust relationship, and then completely create dependence on him. I'm the only one you can trust. You can't trust your teachers. You can't trust your friends. And slowly but surely, they take complete control of this young life in order to exploit them later, until they take total dominance over that young life. Where does this come in with education? So I've talked about human trafficking and how victims are recruited, but what's that got to do with education? Well, I honestly believe that if we are unpacking these subjects within our life orientation curriculum, we're actually exposing our students to what is going on in reality, what is going on in their contexts, in their communities, and allowing them to actually recognize what is going on and respond to it. So firstly, as I said, we have Bodies Are Not Commodities, bank curriculum, and we have an MOU with the Western Cape Education Department that this whole curriculum is actually completely available on the e-learning portal. It's a curriculum made by teachers for teachers with video content, lesson plans, as well as activities that you can do with your students. It's a 5-lesson plan to talk about human trafficking within the context of life orientation. And we've actually rewritten it so it specifically fits in with the CAPS within LO. Now that's freely available on the e-learning portal. And what we love about this program is that it actually talks about prevention. So as I said, the learners are then equipped to recognize trafficking, not just globally, but in their context. How do I recognize my friend being groomed? How do I recognize an unhealthy environment that I'm in that's maybe grooming me or recruiting me for human trafficking? And then they have the tools to know how to respond to it and what to do if they see in their situation. And then secondly, taking awareness to action. You can take the next slide there, Joel. Awareness to action. We don't just want to see prevention. I think we often, kids or children, learners can be overwhelmed with all the things that could happen to them, but rather talking to them about their character, about their citizenship, how they can be agents of change. So you're aware of what human trafficking is. Now be an agent of change. Talk about it, prevent it from happening in your community, fundraise for it, be an activist against it. So we're actually talking to learners about how to be an agent of change in their environment. As A21, we strongly believe that education is one of the key tools that we have in order to eradicate human trafficking on the earth. Bank or Bodies Are Not Commodities is one of the tools that we have. We also have parent guides. I saw some teachers asking, how do we bring our parents into this conversation? We have parent guides that helps parents to talk to their children about human trafficking from the age of 6 up to, whether you're 6 or 16, we have those guides to help parents to have those conversations. We have primary prevention material as well. So I really want to encourage you, if you have any questions about this material, how to access it on the e-learning portal, you're welcome to give us a call on 0800 222 777. That's a national human trafficking hotline that A21 hosts nationally. So if you think you see anything about human trafficking or you just want to find out more how to access this material, feel free to check out the website or to jump on the hotline and give us a call. But I just wanted to say thank you to the life orientation curriculum, and Mr. Taladia especially, for all the work that he's done in assisting us to get this curriculum readily and freely available to all the teachers. And I really hope that it'll be a great resource for you for talking about the issue of human trafficking and gender-based violence within your class. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Katie. Thanks for drawing attention so eloquently to the high levels of vulnerability, as well as sharing the resources which become tools that our teachers can use to addressing the particular problems. We have Ms. Dudley with us now. So, Ms. Dudley, we introduced you as the Director for General Education and Training, as a high energy, high skills director leading the general education and training processes in the Western Cape Education Department. I'm going to hand over to you to present your input. Thank you.
Good day, everybody, and thank you, Mr. Mohammed and colleagues, to be able to be part of this wonderful webinar in terms of gender-based violence. And thank you so much for those introductory remarks, sir. Ladies and gentlemen, I think the one thing I want to start off by saying is that denying people the freedom to choose their path in life because of their gender prevents them from fulfilling their potential. And I want to read that once again, if you'd allow me to. Denying people the freedom to choose their path in life because of their gender prevents them from gaining their full life potential. And so today, on behalf of the Western Cape Education Department, and in particular the GET Curriculum Directorate of the Western Cape, we're very proud of the fact that we're part of this gender-based violence webinar in bringing across the message not only to our province, but to the rest of the globe, ladies and gentlemen, because this is an age-old discussion, but how do we take it forward? How does it become ingrained in the mindsets of people? And until we change the mindsets, and the one biggest factor we have here to our advantage, and I'm very convinced that this is just but the beginning of changing those mindsets. And so, Mr. Taladia, congratulations to you and to your life orientation team of colleagues here that is driving this, ladies and gentlemen. But the one thing I do want to underscore here is that while Mr. Taladia and other role players within this webinar are using life orientation as the source base in education, I want to challenge all school leaders. I want to challenge all community leaders. I want to challenge teacher unions. I want to challenge our National Department of Education, our Western Cape Education Department, that this needs to be on our agenda, ladies and gentlemen. This needs to be within, as we are already addressing it in our curriculum. So it shouldn't only be, while we dedicate, of which we're very appreciative of, and we support 16 days of activism. It's how, I think, Mr. Taladia, Katie, you've also made mention of it, how we change the mindsets of people. How do we go about, at the end of the day, addressing those societal norms, or what we think and regard as norms of patriarchy? And how do we prepare our males to react in a certain way? Mr. Taladia spoke, ladies and gentlemen, about an issue of urination. It's not only those are but one of the issues. When a young lady walks down the road and some people call it a dog whistle, a cat whistle, etc. If a young boy or a young person, that then perceives that, it might seem complimentary, but to a woman it may not be complimentary, or to another person it may not be complimentary. And it's how do I walk past as a citizen of South Africa? Do I think at a school and as a teacher that I will not talk about GBV, gender-based violence, because we'll discuss that in the life orientation lesson. And therefore, my challenge earlier on to all citizens of South Africa, if I am aware of my neighbor who's in that, and I hear and I see through my kitchen window, what do? Do I call the hotline number? Or do I say, I'm so sorry, it's none of my business, and draw the blinds? It's what do I do, each one of us, to take that pledge and say, gender-based violence stops with me. I commit myself to engage, to report, to be part of the prevention thereof in my behavior, in my reactions, in my speech. That is where it starts. And ladies and gentlemen, I think Ismail put it so beautifully this morning when he said, I want to talk to teachers this morning. And so I also want to say, teachers are the most important resource that we have globally. Schools can either be a breeding ground, and schools and education institutions, including higher education institutions, have become breeding grounds for violence. Let's change that narrative. About approximately 246 million children globally have been abused at schools around the globe in 1 year. And that is just, and I'm saying this is a global issue. But so what are we going to do about those gender-based violence incidents? Because it cuts across cultures, it crosses across regions as well as economies. And so what is the man's role in gender equality? What do I teach my children if I were a male figure? How do I do? Do I come home and say, well, darling, what's for supper tonight? Is that really the role of a woman? Do we see gender-based violence as only a punch in the face or an attack? Or do we look at it from an emotional perspective, from an economic perspective, from a job perspective? And education is not only about teaching content to children. We as educators, including myself, it's about educating the child holistically. There is the world of work out there, and not just content in a textbook or what I present to my learner, but how I action and how I exemplify that in my behavior, ladies and gentlemen. And so while teachers are our greatest resource globally, I also want to say that as educators, we need to take that negative social norm and drive that gender-based agenda to be able to change it and create a society of equal gender. So what is all of our roles? I'm saying that, first of all, with our teachers, you spoke about the values of our education in the WCED, of which we're very proud of, Ismail. But how do we, first of all, teachers need to feel safe, and teachers need to be valued, ladies and gentlemen. And therefore, if you value an asset, they are your biggest resource. And how do we do this? We need to empower our teachers, which we are doing, is by training our teachers. We also need to then listen to our teachers. Very often, we speak and we say, I'm listening, but we listen to respond. And so listen to the voices of our teachers. And that's why I called on our teacher unions. The role of our teacher unions in gender-based violence, the role of our school governing bodies. And then after valuing our teachers, training our teachers, listening to our teachers, because remember we're saying our teachers are our biggest resource that we have. We also hold all school managers and teachers accountable. The schools must then, ladies and gentlemen, have clear codes of conduct and ethical guidelines. So a lot of schools have clear codes of conduct and they have ethical guidelines, and it's about behavior. But let's bring into the conversation and write up into the school code of ethics gender-based violence. And I think that word in itself, or that acronym GBV, hasn't been exemplified enough in the school's code of conduct. So for school governing bodies out there, school managers, I challenge you once again, usually after 3 to 6 months, one looks at your school of code of conduct, especially in the time of COVID now, you will be reviewing it. And let's see how we bring that into our school code of conduct, sharing it in our prospectus of our schools, putting it on the website of our schools, and making sure, do we have our RCLs also taking up this discussion? We see also how teachers and female teachers very often don't want to talk about gender-based violence because they are a product of that gender-based violence. And so how do we as male teachers surround them, make them feel safe, make them feel supported? Because it's not about a feminist act, I always say, about taking off your bra and burning it. It's beautiful to be a woman. It's wonderful to celebrate your sexuality. And I think our Creator has created us, each one's gender, for a specific reason. But how do we then raise the level of the girl child? And it's up to us in education, and I include myself. And so, ladies and gentlemen, my closing remarks are, How do we then take education forward? Let's take a pledge today. And at the end, if our moderator, our Chief Director, Mr. Mohammed, would say, ladies and gentlemen, in the side panel chat, say how you take your pledge today to be able to say, where I see it in my neighborhood, where I see it in my school, where I see it in my family, any part in a restaurant, I will stand up for gender-based violence and I will make my voice heard. Thank you so much, Mr. Mohammed. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you very much, Karen, for that, and you deserve a round of applause for contextualizing all the issues. We will come back in the Q&A time for more discussion on the issues that all the speakers have raised. So from one Karen to another, our next presenter is Karen Walstra. She's an education consultant. Her specialization is in critical and creative thinking. She is an author, a presenter, and a teacher. Her main background has been in education technology. She's worked for Google. And so without further delay, Karen, it's over to you.
So, hello everybody. I feel really privileged to be included in this team of people speaking to you today. I've been working with Mr. Taladia and his team of life orientation teachers for the last few months in terms of how we look at online safety and putting that into the life orientation curriculum. So I was working with Google and we put together a series of lessons from grade 8 to grade 12. And in doing that, we explored all the different possible opportunities in terms of being online and how you can actually work within that space. I'm just going to share my screen and present to you. So for me, the really interesting thing around life orientation is I think it's a vital subject at school. And often it's downplayed by the school in terms of not seen as important. But if you look at all the different topics that are actually in life orientation, each of those topics really embeds and can assist the learners in their way forward in terms of life. And so I think too, for life orientation, gender-based violence can do exactly the same within that space. So if we look at online safety and the pathway we looked at for life orientation with being online, we started off by saying to the grade 8s, how can you be safe? And looking at their own personal settings and how do they speak to people online and what are the kinds of things that you do in terms of being groomed and being followed and that kind of thing around being safe for yourself. In grade 9, we moved on about being respectful. So not bullying each other. And what does that actually mean? And being respectful in terms of how you engage digitally in terms of yourself. And would you say some of the things you say digitally as accurately or as honestly as you do online? So sometimes people say dreadful things online that they would never say to somebody when they're seeing them. And so we should actually treat the way we use our digital language in exactly the same way as if we were standing in front of each other. And then in grade 10, we start looking at how do you actually keep yourself to being safe, being aware of wanting to learn and grow. And then grade 11, looking at being responsible. So what is the kind of content you put out there? Is it appropriate? Will this actually assist me in terms of getting a job? How am I being creative with the content that I'm creating, but at the same time being responsible in terms of, is it ethically right? And then in grade 12, we look at, am I making myself future ready to be successful? And so using the digital tools to actually grow themselves across their years of schooling. So when we talk about gender-based violence, this comes in so many different shapes and forms. And if you think about all the different ways, it really can impact the students from just so many different levels. So we often just speak about it in terms of women and girls, but how are we actually empowering the women and the girls in our society? How are we saying to the girls, you can actually make a comment, that you have a voice? Even if you listen to teachers in staff rooms, teachers themselves sometimes will say things like, oh, I can't do that, my husband won't allow me to, or I can't attend a meeting because my husband says I can't. And so how are we empowering even the people that we're working with? How are we seeing everybody in the community as valued, whatever your sexual preference or however you see your role, that we're actually empowering everybody within that space? How are we actually encouraging our children that if they're feeling uncomfortable or things are not good at home, how are they actually being allowed to air their views around the violence that they may be experiencing at home? Or what about people who are in abusive relationships, whether it's a boyfriend or whether it's a husband? Do we create the space within our school classrooms or within our school environment that they feel comfortable, that they can actually come and speak about it? Or what about if we just think of society where men are just seen as more dominant and can take control? And as women, we often allow that just to happen. And so we are groomed into, oh no, we need to be submissive. How are we as women actually showing that we can take ownership, that we can take power? How are we questioning things within our spaces within schools? If people are saying, but from a structural point of view, the men should do this and the women do that. How are we actually creating this to open the opportunities for self-growth? We live often in a patriarchal society. It's a huge question and a big elephant in the room. But how do we allow students to actually discuss it and explore these kinds of things and actually question some of the things that have come down in long traditions and are not always easy to discuss? And then what about direct family violence that happens just within every single child, that happens at school? And do they feel comfortable in terms of addressing that? For me, life orientation then provides this wonderful gateway to address all these different types of issues in the various topics that come up. First of all, you're creating an awareness when you're having these discussions, where the children can feel comfortable around speaking about human trafficking or bullying or cyberbullying, that the children can actually know that they're in a safe space to do that, that you allow for discussion, that it doesn't matter who is saying what, that the discussion is allowed, that you've put parameters within that space, that you feel safe, that children can feel comfortable within opening their ideas. You allow for meaningful debate. So getting the students to actually put debates together and looking at situations from different points of view and saying, if I was pro or against, how would I actually view this? And therefore then opening the mindsets of the children perhaps to something that they weren't exposed to, because we're making them think about how would you discuss it from the other person's point of view. That if we look at all the different topics within life orientation, how many of them relate to gender-based violence, and how we can be telling the children not just during a small period of time of the year, but we could be bringing it into many lessons in terms of what we are teaching. That within that space, you are therefore empowering the girl children who are in your schools. And you are saying to them, it's okay to share. It's okay to talk. And at the same time, we are assisting boys who often feel in modern society that the girls are focused on more than themselves. That we're saying to them, you too have a voice. Have your say, and let's see how we can find solutions together. And then encouraging the reporting of violence, because within the school space, we are able to then look at it and say how you can report. These are the processes. So Katie gave you one example, but just being able to come to your life orientation teacher and have that chat is so very, very important. And then having debates and discussions around analyzing violence, looking on the web, what are the stats, and how can we actually address that within our school? How can we address it within our community? Can we do surveys and things around our communities and see how can I, as an individual, take power within that? And so for me, I think that the more relevant we make topics, the more open we discuss them, the more we create meaning for the learners, so that they will then see these kinds of discussions as valuable, and so see how they would grow. So for me, therefore, subjects like life orientation truly empowers the learners and informs them and creates an awareness among the children in everything that we do, and so that the students can actually grow and learn from the space. I think it's how we actually say to the children, let's take it, as Karen was saying, and make it our own. Empower yourself within this so that you can make a difference. And I definitely agree with what Karen was saying, where it all starts with me. You have the power to control it yourself. And if you don't feel empowered, that you can go to people at school, go to the individuals you trust, whether it's another teacher or whether it's your life orientation teacher. Start with where you feel comfortable, but address it. Address it so that you are empowered. So for me, I feel that life orientation is a crucial subject that should really be seen as much more important in lots of instances. Because if we look at all the topics that are covered within there, we can really empower our students on so many levels. And this is just one of them. Thank you so much for allowing me to share my thoughts and ideas. I really do think that as teachers, we hold the key in terms of how we actually empower our students. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Karen, for adding to the subject of the importance of life orientation as a subject, but also for adding to the body of ideas and the details of how we can take some of these issues further forward. Colleagues and audience, we now reach the point where some of the questions that you've been putting on the chat will be responded to. Please keep posting them on. We will manage from behind to see how we can cluster them and give the panel an opportunity to respond to them as effectively as possible. But before we get to that, I've just identified a couple of key things that came through both from the presentations as well as from the questions and the comments on the side channel. Firstly, thanks very much for all the pledges of commitment that Ms. Dudley asked you to pledge yourself to. It's important for that kind of commitment for us to tackle the deep issues in any meaningful way. I think everybody knows very well we are tackling very, very difficult issues. These issues are not new in my experience. I think I've been engaged with them in some way or the other for the last 40 years. And the severity and intensity of them still remain. If you've been following the news channels, for example, in 2 or 3 of the presidential statements that were made, one of the most alarming things that was coming through was that, as we mentioned at the beginning, with COVID taking form as it did, it forced us into spending more time at home and with our families. But the downside of it is that the ugly side of the realities in our society also came to the surface. So I'm just going to list a few of them, and by listing them, I'm also inviting the panel, in addition to the questions, to elaborate further on them. Ismail, in his presentation, raised the important issue of character building and respect, and some of you on the side were affirming the importance of those issues. So maybe we should say a little bit more about the how part of building that through life orientation. But may I also add that while we're using life orientation as a point of departure for addressing this issue, it is opportune for us to also include in other subjects a platform for some of these. I'm just thinking in the languages curriculum, for example, there's ample space in including the right kinds of reading matter, the literature, the poetry, the essay writing, the creative writing can find space for that. It may surprise some people for me to say this, but in mathematics, so in Katie's presentation, 54% of the population is vulnerable. It could be a very fascinating maths lesson, to unpack the implications of that percentage, etc., etc. Then somebody raised the issue of the importance of training teachers. So maybe we could have a few more ideas and discussions about that. Critically was the question of the role of parents. And I think the one comment was reflecting the fact that often it is what the parents teach in the home that spills over into the school. And sometimes schools are on the defensive then because, the weight of what happens, the ideology of what happens in the home is stronger than the ideology of what can be done in the school environment. And so, a process of taking the whole discussion more broadly than just the immediate school environment. Then there was the issue of the role of social media. And, unfortunately, because of the nature of the social media medium, anybody, or the liberty to post whatever you want to is higher than the levels of values and respect that we want for the posting to present. And so maybe there needs to be a discussion about that arena. One of the commentators on the side panel was raising the issue of the place of romantic relationships, how teenagers and young people manage their relationships, and particularly how girls fall prey to sugar daddies and that phenomenon. Another commentator raised the issue of linking life orientation more strongly to the school-based support teams as an area for strengthening the linkages. Karen Dudley raised the issue of the inclusion of this item in the School of Conduct and practical steps that can be taken by the school community in incorporating it as part of its school ethos. And then just lastly, somebody raised the issue of, focusing more strongly on male chauvinism and about the way in which boys get reared and the education role that we need to play in that regard. So that's my summary of the key issues that I've identified. The technical team will be flashing some of the questions on the screen, but I'm going to now throw open to the panel for anyone to respond to any of the issues that have arisen. And then as the questions appear on the screen, please feel free to come in. And unless you are going out of control, I'm going to allow free flow of the discussion. So maybe let's start with Ismail and keep the order of the speakers as we had in the session. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Harun. There's a question on the screen at the moment. My question is, when will the rollout of comprehensive sexuality education take place? I must just say to that teacher that we've already rolled it out. We've started rolling out comprehensive sexuality education over the past 4 years with definite support material. So there is learner support material and this material and for teachers to use in that particular space. And we're developing more materials. In fact, a couple of the people of our participants in this particular webinar are the authors of those documents. So definitely they will come out to your school and we will pick up with you, Ms. Kester, after the session, and we will address the fact that it should have been happening in your school already. But I want to go back to one of the questions that was posed to me on the side chat around the issue of parents. How do we get parents involved? And I think parents play a critical role in this process, but we must also understand what the parents' role is and what our role is within the education department. And I think critical from an education perspective is that we are there to support what the parents are doing at home. But in the absence of parents engaging at that level, the teacher then becomes pivotal. However, we need to use the platforms of teacher-parent meetings. We need to use the assemblies and invite parents. We need to get the school governing bodies to actually set up those meetings with parents and get our teachers to address some of these topics. And I'm sure there are activists within the communities that can speak to this particular issue, and that is how we're going to engage parents. But it's also the discussions that teachers are having with learners within the classroom, that those discussions be taken home and for the learners to engage with the parents on some of these topics. One of my colleagues just alluded me to the issue of Women's Month, and it is by coincidence that we're addressing the gender-based violence at the start of Women's Month. But I think it's so important that we establish this particular platform for the conversation, because whilst we are addressing the issue of Women's Month and we're highlighting the challenges of women, we must bring into the conversation this issue of GBV and include our parents as part of that particular conversation. So all of the platforms that become available to us, we must exploit, but exploit for the sake of doing good. And I think that is basically what we're looking at in terms of addressing these issues. When we talk to our teacher unions, when they're addressing their members, it is about these issues that we need to speak, and it mustn't happen when there's a crisis. It is an ongoing discussion because the curriculum is ongoing. The curriculum, as we've indicated to you, starts at grade 4 level and needs to run through to grade 12. So we can't have it when there's a crisis in the country and then focus on gender-based violence. It is an ongoing discussion. Comprehensive sexuality education is an ongoing discussion. Choosing subjects is an ongoing discussion. It doesn't stop. And therefore, we're doing is highlighting some of these issues when our communities are not picking that up strong enough. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ismail. I'm just going to follow the order of the speakers. So, Katie, would you like to respond to any of the issues that have come up?
If you're talking about any of the issues, there was one question that came up talking about using passwords with children and engaging in support services with your community. I think those are two different questions which I'll chat to. I definitely agree with knowing the support services within your community and bringing awareness to your students about them. A21 being one of them, for example. We've seen such strength when there have been different organizations within the community being made aware to the learners that they can actually come and find out who is around, who are the people that I can go to if home is not a safe space, or if friendship groups are not a safe space, who is there. So I definitely agree with that. And I do think that we can all take individual responsibility for reaching out to the schools in our areas, but schools also reaching out to organizations in their areas and inviting them into a platform, like that. With regards to having a password with your children, that's definitely something we teach, especially to the smaller children, even as young as 4 or 5, is having a password, so that if someone were to approach you and say, hey, mommy told me to come and pick you up, or daddy told me to come and pick you up, the child knows that unless this person presents the password to them, they're not to get in the car with this person. And I can remember as a teenager, even someone came to pick me up from school and I knew them, they were my neighbor, but I didn't know that my mom had sent them. And my mom called me on her cell phone and said, I've sent this person to come and get you. So even back then when I was in school, we even need to be aware that it's not always stranger danger. Very often this violence, human trafficking, sexual exploitation, it's happening from people that you know and trust. And so having your safe circle, we always say there's a safe circle of people that you trust or that parents trust, and only 1 or 2 of them have access to the password, not allowing our children to be in necessarily anybody that they could know or be comfortable with in the community having access to them. So yes, passwords is one technique, but if you want to talk more about some of the techniques we talk about, especially with the younger children, you're welcome to contact us as an organization. And then obviously within the high school curriculum, we've kind of moved, a little bit further, more developed with that on how to stay safe. So, we can definitely have those discussions.
Thank you very much, Katie. Somebody was asking whether the presentations will be available. They will definitely be circulated. They will get through to you. And there was also a suggestion that discussions of this nature should continue further. I'm sure Mr. Taladia and team has a plan for that. Karen Walstra, I'm going to take you first and then come to Karen Dudley, if you don't mind. Karen Dudley, Karen Walstra, over to you.
Thank you, Mr. Mohammed. So there are a few questions that I think, one, I definitely agree that this shouldn't work in a vacuum, But I do think as teachers, it starts with what is the example we setting as teachers? So how are we engaging with our learners? So that's what we can control as teachers. We can't control what's happening at home, but we can control what's happening in our school, what's happening in our classrooms. So how are teachers joking with each other? Sometimes teachers are joking, and as adults, they realize it's a joke, but the children could interpret that as, oh, that person's been bullied by that person. And teachers sometimes do that in a fun way. How are we reacting to those types of things? So what is the behavior children can mimic from us as teachers? I think is really, really important, because they do copy us. And whether it's how we engage with each other as adults or how we engage with our children, I think we've got to be aware of that. So what are we like at school? Are we setting the example that's appropriate for our students? If our children Google us, what do they see? What are our profile pictures looking like? What are our Facebook pages? What are all the social media? As teachers, if the children Google you, what do they see? And that's really, really important. Where we're using video calls as a means of engaging with our children. Sorry, my earphone just fell out. Give me a second. If we think of how we are engaging with our students with video conferencing, when we switch our cameras off, what's the picture that comes up? Is it a holiday picture where we're not wearing appropriate clothing for a school, or is it appropriate? So we've got to put our teachers' hats on. Whether we like it or not, we are teachers all the time, in every single space that we're in. And so whether it's social aspects, if there's a social at school, how are we behaving? So yes, we do need to include our families. We do need to have the bigger picture, but it all starts with me at school. How am I behaving? How are we interacting as peers? So for me, that's really, really important. Then a couple of questions that came across was, how do we actually get to the boys? How do we actually empower the boys? And for me, that's also really important, that we have these discussions in terms of what does it mean to be a man? How do you treat other ladies? I think it's also, how do the male teachers treat the woman? And that comes through really strongly in schools. And is there a good relationship between the males and the female staff? Because again, it's that environment that the students can see and mimic. And so all of it is really complex. There isn't one answer that fits all. But for me, I think if we all take responsibility as teachers, so how am I behaving? If you say something that's not appropriate, do you go up to the children and actually apologize? Do we actually recognize if we've made a mistake? Can we be humble enough as adults to go to the children and say, oh, I really lost my temper today. I'm so sorry. I shouldn't have done that. So how do we actually engage with our students on all sorts of levels? And then how do we react within school? And how are we treated in the school hierarchy? Can you actually go in and speak to somebody at school who's of a higher position? Or do you get moaned at and told, no, go through the train? So how are we actually looking at the whole school system as a school environment? Because that can be mimicked again at home. And so we're showing the children an example. Those are just some thoughts. And remember, there's lots of different ways of addressing this. But I do think it all starts with me. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much, Karen Walstra. Karen Dudley, over to you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Mohammed. For me, once again, ladies and gentlemen, and Karen, my namesake, I think addressed the issue in terms of the question was addressed both to Karen Walstra and both to either one of us in terms of how do we take our boys forward in this? And being a mother of two sons myself, you know, it's about so starting for the parent at home itself, but you as the extended parent being the teacher at school. And we also know that most times our children will tell us as parents, but my teacher said. So never underestimate, I would say, the power you have of a teacher. and your engagement and your time of engagement. We are in unprecedented times. We don't see our learners on a face-to-face basis. We see them on a mask-to-mask, but that doesn't, the relationship you build up with them already, ladies and gentlemen. Don't underestimate that power and that relationship of you as a teacher. I think I want to echo very strongly what you've said, Karen, is how do we mimic of the behavior that our learners see? They tend, because we think, don't they know that I'm also human? But when you take up the profession, the ethical profession of education, you're in a public space. And so whether they meet you in a supermarket, whether you crack a little joke, what is it and how do they interpret that and see that? And so, yes, you're always at the cutting edge, but it's a wonderful way to be able to mold a life, to influence a life. And so I'd like to say that I want to echo what you're saying then. So for our teachers, I think it also highlights that while we have started that training of sexuality, comprehensive sexuality program, it is how do we take this process now forward, Ismail, in terms of going online where we can't do it face to face, that there is still a need out there for us to continue doing this with new teachers coming in with a change of mindset. Because this is what it is all about, part of our transform to perform strategy and part of our growth mindset. This is part of how we break down, as I mentioned earlier, the societal issues of patriarchy, how we prepare our girl learners for particular roles in society of jobs. Do we still frown upon certain ones or think that girls are not capable of doing? And so it's all about the words that we echo. When a woman says something, do we as male counterparts say, please don't become emotional about it? I actually want to throttle someone when they say that to me, because immediately I think I'm not emotional, I'm passionate about it. If a male speaks out and raises their voice and comes out boisterous, I don't say to him, don't get emotional. I think, wow, cool boy, you go for it. So don't tell me as a female I am emotional. Or I wonder if it's that time of the month that she's a little ratty. And I want to say, how dare you? And for too often, us as women don't open our mouths. And so, ladies, we need to stand up and enjoy our sexuality, enjoy whom we are in our gender, and also stand up for whom we and claim our space as well. And very appreciative, and we love our men around us. But how do we impart that? By what we allow and what power we give away. And so we need to take up that stand as well, how we mimic that behavior, what is said to us, how we react to it. And that doesn't mean if Ismail says something to me about lipstick, that suddenly I say, so why don't you wear lipstick? No, you listen to the conversation, etc. And so for me, I want to end, Mr. Mohammed, by saying it's, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for the side panel chat comments, but really to raise awareness and to act. Raise awareness and act. For me, that's important. Make it part of the conversation with parents in your prospectus. Like we say, enter to learn and leave to serve. You know, do we say hashtag GBV, life orientation condemns GBV? And so what's our hashtag going to be? What's our pledge going to be? Raise awareness, act against GBV. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Karen. Other issues have come up that I've identified. I'm just going to raise them with you, and then the panel is also free to keep responding to the questions that have been coming up. So the one question is, we do have a culture in many communities of parental disengagement. So, you know, we need to acknowledge that particular reality. And then at current time, one commentator is making the point that at schools, we are pushing parents away from the schools at the moment because of social distancing requirements. So at this point in time, that is a challenge that we're needing to manage. But I just want to remind the commentator that that reality will not remain with us forever. It will be with us for a long time, and we need a temporary, mechanism to deal with it. But it's not going to remain with us forever. And another correspondent on the same issue made the point that in their experience, they run a parent discussion information session once a term. And couldn't that be used as a provincial standard? That looks like a good idea. The second set of issues that arose is at primary school level. what is the appropriate way of introducing the discussions. Another discussion is in poor communities, particularly where gangsterism is rife, we have the wrong role models, and how do we begin to address that particular difficulty? And the last one I picked up was, at the moment we have a model of social workers servicing a number of schools, and shouldn't we in the long run be working towards one social worker per school? Those are the ones I've identified so far. Please feel free to respond. Maybe.
Thank you.
Yes, Ismail.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Arun. I have looked at some of those questions. I want to firstly go to the issue of where we find ourselves currently, and we're speaking to the issue of the distancing between parents and the schools because of COVID-19. And that has brought a new device into play. And what we are doing today is using the devices, and our learners and our parents are into these devices in terms of making the connection with schools, which means we're talking about going into cyberspace. And therefore, the cyberspace, the social media becomes a very important tool, one, as a gateway to GBV, gender-based violence, because that is your gateway between two individuals that are going to engage. And therefore, the online safety curriculum that we introduced through the work of Karen and Google, we've brought that awareness to not only our learners, but also to our parents in terms of making them aware of the utilization of the social media platforms and using that responsibly, but also being aware of what engagement your child has on social media and who they are engaging with. So this current situation that we find ourselves in highlights that in particular. But it also becomes important while schools are speaking to parents around the academics, they must also use that same platform to address these issues with parents. So it can be a side note, it can be a webinar that the school sets up with their parents as engaging with parents through this particular period that we're finding ourselves in, and they're dealing online with parents. They need to speak about these things. And I think parents are eager to do something in the evenings. You can only watch so much movies on Netflix. So let's engage, let's talk, let's have conversation around issues that are affecting our communities. And I've seen during the course of the week, there are webinars every week on a Wednesday evening, Thursday evening in our communities that speaks to some of these issues. There is nothing stopping us, teachers, to engage with the school management to set up such webinars with the SGBs. We in Women's Month use Women's Month as the catalyst to engage in these conversations. So there you have a campaign. Let's get the conversation going from a school perspective into our communities. But let's also look at the online safety curriculum, which we have established within the schools in the Western Cape, and let's get the awareness and the responsibility of how to use that social media platform in order to develop not only our learners, but in some instances, our parents as well.
Thank you very much, Ismail. Katie, would you like to go next? You're muted.
Do that every time. Thank you, sir, for the opportunity. I saw there was a question from a lady called Crystal Sharp, and she was asking, how do we raise awareness without overstepping any boundaries regarding parents of the children? I mean, I think you can answer that very many ways, but when you are working with a curriculum that has been approved by Western Cape Education Department and is, kind of gone through all of the checks and balances, I think that you can be safe that if you're sticking to content there, you're raising awareness in a way that parents have approved of if their child is in that school and under that leadership. So, I mean, I think that's probably a fail-safe way. But then I would also think, when we have gone into schools, the parents have usually been notified as well that our organization is coming in to talk about the issue of human trafficking, for example. So that's another thing you can do. But I do believe that if you are talking about a child's human rights and their basic rights, I don't think you can be overstepping the rights of parents as long as you are using approved and appropriate language and not doing it in a crass and coarse way or a way that causes maybe a traumatic response. I think if you're respectful, if you're tasteful, and you're doing it in a way that is outlined in an approved curriculum, I don't think you can be overstepping the boundaries of a parent if they are healthy boundaries. It is our responsibility to raise awareness with children on their basic human rights. What do they have a right to? What do they have a right to say no to? And if we're not doing that, I think we're doing them a disservice within our life orientation curriculum. So that's quite a big one that you've got to unpack, because, you know, if you're not working with an organization that's not approved, then you have to look at their content before you bring them in. But I think you can't go wrong if you're working with something that's sanctioned by the department. I hope that's an okay response to that.
Thank you very much, Katie. Let's take Karen Dudley first this time.
Thank you so much, Mr. Mohammed. I think it's Jamie Landers who's saying, how do we even start breaking the social grooming of males that have been so dominant within society? And I think, Katie, you've covered that. Karen has covered it, etc. It starts, I always say, whenever I share a story, even with my staff, I say, let me use my own children as an example. And so it starts with us, ladies and gentlemen, with our speech, with the mimic of our behavior. It all starts with the human being yourself, how you engage. Do you stop, as I said, or do you close the blinds when you hear an engagement with the neighbor next door? You may say, I don't want to endanger my life, but do I pick up a telephone, or do I send a WhatsApp to the neighborhood watch? Do I call a hotline? Do I offer support to that person afterwards, etc.? So there are many ways. There's not one fixed way of doing it, but how can I find my space as a citizen of this world, of the global society, and what role do I play? Can I join a particular group that can reach out to other women? If I own a printing company, if there's a flyer, can I print and distribute within my neighborhood? And most importantly, if it's a teacher, and Katie, this one you've covered, in terms of the life orientation curriculum. And so, ladies and gentlemen, we do have the trimming of the curriculum. During this pandemic, we also have something what is called the fundamentals of the curriculum, where certain subjects are now being given more time, and the framework of subjects have changed. And one of those subjects that have been given more time and a better global space, which we celebrate. Remember Ismail phoning me and saying, did you see? And I said, yes, life orientation, life skills. Elizabeth in our foundation phase saying, yes, life skills. And so, ladies and gentlemen, there was a stage where there was a discussion as should life skills, life orientation being taken out of the curriculum. And if I had a placard that said, yeah, now, I'd be holding it up and saying, you can see the important role of life orientation. Life skills has been given a broader scope within the fundamentals. It's honing in on this particular subject as well as healthy lifestyles, and this is how we bring it in. So not overstepping our boundaries with parents, but keeping it, and come on, let's be clever about it. Let's use the education, let's use curriculum for the conversation. And if you're not sure about the conversation, lean in on another colleague who can. Invite myself, other colleagues, people like Ismail into your classroom where Zoom classes are happening. If you're having parent meetings and you, a headmaster or headmistress in this chat right now, in this webinar, are you having little grade meetings with your parents for those who can? Because you'll be amazed who's on Facebook, ladies and gentlemen, and when they do get data for that, when they go back to a YouTube video, when children go and view this YouTube video, what have they seen by our comments in the side panel chat? What do they hear from what we are saying right now? And so it's all, once again, as I said earlier on, it starts with me as the individual. Do I stand up and do I say no? Do I engage? And then in terms of social workers, Jamie, you've asked one social worker, what is the department doing about that, etc. And I think with a high profile of life skills and life orientation, we will have to re-look the organogram and those particular posts. So I may not be one of the most highest flyers to make that, but I can make my voice heard. In our particular meetings, I know people like Mr. Mohammed and others will make their voices heard in terms of how do we increase that platform and how serious are we in giving that particular support in terms of psychosocial support. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Karen Dudley. Karen Wallstra, your turn.
Thank you so much. So one of the comments earlier that Crystal made was talking about how do we do this even in primary schools? And I don't think it's just a high school issue. I do think it's things that we can be addressing from little children. So how do we let the little children play with each other and talk to each other? Do we allow bullying within those peer groups just at school? And the same way is how are we speaking to the little children in our schools? So for me, it isn't something that we suddenly start discussing when the children get into grade 7, or it's what are we doing right the way through our schooling and how are we helping children within the space? I do think I want to reiterate what Ishmael was saying in terms of just because we can't see our parents face to face in terms of at a school, use your video conferencing tools for parents. Have parent chat evenings, have video sessions within the spaces. I know both Microsoft and Google with their streaming have actually opened up the numbers to be bigger during this space. So if you're a Google school, I think you can have up to 250 people in a meet at a time. And I think the Microsoft meets are something similar. So you can be having big groups of parents within a discussion, have people addressing, and then they can be part of the discussion. So think about how you can involve parents. The same is for your children. Don't just use it for video calls in terms of lessons. What about organizing break times where children can actually just socialize with using the digital tools so they can see each other and talk about, oh, look at the new thing I've made, or I got this kind of toy, or the same kinds of things they would be doing at break time. And you as the teacher can be on duty, but allowing them to talk and to share. And the same with staff development, same, using the tools, setting an example from a social point of view. Have a meeting where you're actually just sharing, talking. So for me, yes, there's a distance, but in another way, you can actually bring it all together and you can be setting the example just like you are in the school time and in the playtime. So for me, it's how do we start with ourselves? How do we make it relevant to the subject we're teaching? Somebody else spoke about it earlier, that it shouldn't just be life orientation. I think that's also vital. So how are we having the discussion with other teachers around these topics? So what are we actually presenting to the children to read? Are we actually taking that same book and discussing the themes in life orientation? The same with bringing it into maths. Maths often thinks it's different and we do differently, but we can really be incorporating all these topics around what we're doing in every subject. So it's not just in one subject, but we're making an awareness in every subject, in the way that we teach, in the content that we're teaching, and the way we engage with our learners in those spaces. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Karen. Are you responding further, Ismail?
Yes, I am, and I'm saying that it needs to cut across the curriculum when we're talking about GBV, and I think our language counterparts are critically important in this process because, as I've mentioned in my presentation, the language that the teacher uses in the classroom is going to play a big role in terms of how learners respond and whether we either entrenching and embedding the thinking around gender-based violence, or we're beginning to break down the issues around gender-based violence through the language that we use in the class. I'm also saying that our language teachers need to also not only look at the language that is being used, but also the kind of discussions that they're having. And so whenever the language teachers are looking for appropriate topics, use topics that will speak to the issue of gender-based violence in order to have the learners engage in a full-on discussion. So again, it is beginning to see the thread running through the education program as a whole, even though we may be focusing it on in life orientation, but it does have space within all of the other subjects to be addressed in a particular way. Which also brings me back to one of the questions that was posted on the issue of role models in our communities, especially in our deprived communities. I taught at a high school in Mitchells Plain for over 25 years, well, close to 30 years. And it was when we started at the school, it was a gang-infested school. It was in a gang-infested area. It's still in a gang-infested area. However, our teachers have become role models for our learners. And so I'm sure, based on our experiences, we've turned many learners' lives around through the use of sport, through the language that we use in the classroom, through what we were doing at school, at the particular school, in order to turn the mindset of learners around what happens at that particular school. So it can be done, and it has been done over a very long period of time, but it's something that we need to continue to do. We cannot become victims of our circumstances wherever we're teaching and say, well, what am I going to do? I'm up against a tsunami here. No, we have to take responsibility the moment we step into that particular classroom, and through our words, through our language, through our actions, in terms of the values that we stand for, we can impact on learners' lives. And I think that is why people go into the teaching profession, because they want to make an impact on learners' lives. So colleagues, it does become important that we take that responsibility when we're stepping into the classroom.
Thank you, Ismail. I'm just saying to the panelists, you are free to pick up on any of the other issues. I've just picked up in this round a few others. Somebody made an interesting comment about the link between all of this work and emotional intelligence. There was an issue around teachers as poor role models, the importance of the power of language and not reducing gender to binaries. There was a request that we communicate to schools, possibly through a letter on this item following this webinar, which I think is an excellent idea as part of an ongoing process that this webinar is initiating. An issue around cultural perceptions in certain cultures, gender roles, work on a relation of subordination and domination. The issue of sometimes students or learners becoming the friend of the teacher and how to manage that particular relationship. Question of GBV being part of the hidden curriculum, and teachers being afraid to engage in certain zones of communication. And then just lastly, the issue of young teachers coming into schools and then being prone to harassment by seniors and managers is what I picked up. So panel, whoever wants to go first, please go. Katie, maybe you want to come in next, and then Karen Wallstra and Karen Dudley, and then we'll round off. Katie, would you like to go first?
Yeah, great. Thank you for the opportunity. I think there were very many important points raised there, but I'd probably leave my fellow educator colleagues to respond to those. I don't want to talk out of turn with that. But I do just want to say that I think it's vital as an educator, if you are covering a topic within your class or within your students, and if you don't know much about it, educate yourself on it as well. I know there've been a couple of comments like that. You can educate yourself further or reach out to other colleagues who may have more experience in that area. But again, I would like to put ourselves forward. We are always here as well to guide, on how to have those conversations and even where to report. I'd also like to say, I know a lot of the teachers are talking about more social workers for schools. Can I just say we fully advocate for that as well. We have seen incredible work with social workers working alongside schools within the Western Cape Education Department and actually bringing us and other organizations like us into the schools. And there've been incredible connections from that. So the social workers working alongside teachers are phenomenal, true heroes. And I do believe that more of them would just actually provide more support, more role models, more safety nets for our students, that when we're covering these topics within life orientation, they actually have the safety net to catch them if this does strike a chord with them, or if it is something they've been a victim of. So thank you for this webinar. And I think, that's what I'll close off on.
Thank you very much. Karen Wallstra.
Again, just thank you for involving me within the discussion. I think, again, it just goes back to us as teachers. I think we should always think of ourselves on our own learning path. So agreeing with what Katie and Karen have said, where How are you growing yourself as a teacher? Whatever subject you're teaching, there's always new research and information coming out. So how are you continually growing and making yourself aware of what's around there? And in terms of whether it's using digital or non-digital in your classroom, whether it's a methodology you're using or the actual content knowledge, it's how you're empowering yourself so that you can actually be on the same wavelength as your children. So we know children have changed. People keep saying they're not like when I started teaching, or children are different. Well, how are you researching how to engage with the students differently? How are you making your students excited about what you teach? Whatever the subject, whatever the topic, it all goes back to you in the classroom. You have that control. And so to end off today, again, I think if we want to see a difference within our societies, it starts with each and every one of us. If each of us in a school as teachers makes a little bit of difference, just think of all the teachers that there are. And then if we can actually make that awareness within our students, think of every single child you've taught and how you then could be planting seeds of change within those children. And so for me, it all is, how do I impact in my small way? Because all the ripples then impact each other. And we can then have a really big impact in terms of change. And so how do we start off small? We can't do everything, but we can start off with what we can control. And therefore, if we then slowly start changing that, we would see a bigger impact. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Karen. Karen Dudley.
Thank you, Mr. Mohammed. Once again to my colleagues and, Microsoft, Google, to you, Mr. Mohammed, as the moderator, to our audience out there. Thank you once again for the opportunity. To one of my favorite guys, to Ismail Tiladia. Thank you, Ismail, for leading this province in life orientation, together with our other counterpart, Elizabeth Fredericks, within the foundation phase as well, because someone said, how does it start within primary schools? In the conversation, you don't need to in the primary school say, and now today we will talk about. Once again, it could be in the material that you choose to tell a little story. What is the GBV or the gender discrimination, the subtleness in that story bringing across, is it the knight in the shining armor coming along to this damsel in distress, etc. And while those are all seems like, and so you have all different kinds of, so what materials do you expose your learners to without telling them, now we're doing a grade one learner, gender-based violence. It's little games, it's activities, do boys walking before girls, all of those sorts of things, how does one, it's all part of your behavior, it's part of your communication. And then once again, let's use the power of education. Let's use the power, and raise the level of the educator. As we said, educators, teachers are our most valuable resource globally. I said earlier on, don't underestimate the power of a teacher. And so use that power to change the narrative in your teaching. Yes, you have lesson plans, all of these. How do you combine all of that within your narrative? Children talk to you so much during the day. I know when I was teaching and also teaching at a school in Mitchell's Plain, by the time I got home, I didn't want anyone to talk to me because I'd spoken so much for the day, and still now. But I'm saying let's use that those conversations as narratives. Let's make sure when we publish things on this site, ladies and gentlemen, in any way, whichever platform we use educationally, let's engage with the hashtag WCED condemns GBV. Let's adopt that when we take that pledge today, for those of us, when we post any comments, we say hashtag WCED condemns GBV, and let's make part of that conversation going forward. Thank you, Mr. Mohammed.
Thank you very much, Ms. Dudley. So we're coming to the end of the very inspirational webinar. Mr. Tiladia will do a way forward in a few minutes. I just want to quickly end off by saying, firstly, even though we were not physically present amongst each other, one could feel the fantastic positive energy around the webinar. And so a deep gratitude to everybody for creating a positive climate around a very difficult discussion. Just in terms of what COVID has done, if I can just go back to the comments that I made when I started. What is visible on the horizon as we go further forward is that curriculum and life orientation being a key part of the curriculum is going to have to deal with health, safety, and what I call pandemic and emergency or disaster resilience. All the international literature is telling us that that's what we need to be starting to do more of in our curriculum. In South Africa, between the beginning of the lockdown and now, more than 4 million people have lost their jobs, and the projections are that more people will be losing their jobs. So the curriculum has the responsibility of responding as positively as it can to contribute to that. As I mentioned on the newscast that I've been listening to as reports were coming through on the way the pandemic is affecting South African society, gender-based violence frequently came up. And so it is the responsibility of the curriculum to address that. And then just lastly, even though the pandemic is occupying our minds, digital literacy remains a big issue for us to be keeping in mind as we're going further forward. With those comments, thank you very much for allowing me to be your moderator. The comments on the side are saying it's been a fruitful discussion. So fantastically well done to the team that put everything together. And I'm going to hand over to Ismail, as I say. Thank you very much for being with us. And I was going to say, safe journey back home, but many of us are in our homes. So safe journey on the continuing time you'll be having at home, at your work. Over to you, Ismail.
Thank you, Mr. Mohammed, and thank you to the panelists and all the people that have joined us in this particular webinar. I think the discussion is critically important. I think we need to continue with these types of discussions because it just opens up our minds. And in that regard, I want to invite you to our next seminar, or rather webinar, where we will focus on specifically as life orientation on grade 9 subject choices. So we will have a panel of experts in to speak to you as a life orientation teacher as we prepare our grade 9 learners for their subject choices, which will happen and has to happen over the next few months. We will follow that up with a physical education webinar as well, because we want to keep our teachers focused in terms of their well-being, both physical and mental. And we want to continue with these types of webinars going forward. On behalf of the Life Orientation team, I'd like to thank our panelists once again. I'd like to thank you, Mr. Mohammed, for your inputs and moderating the session. My director, Ms. Karen Dudley, for her inputs. And then very importantly, that young man, Joel Kaplan, in the background, who's been doing all the technical things for us, and Jamil, a subject advisor, and Eureka Bierkes for their inputs in terms of making sure that all the technical side of things have been sorted out. Thank you to a wonderful team, and thank you for the inputs that you have made. Please, the conversation doesn't stop here. Please drop us a mail so that if you feel that there are still important things that we need to address, then let us know and we will pick it up from our side. To everyone, thank you very much for your inputs.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.